Episode 22 of the WildFed podcast, Mining Down the Biomass from Cod to Kelp with Robert Steneck, is brought to you by Surthrival. Now's the time to fortify your immune system with scientifically validated nutrients, functional foods, and herbal medicines that give you confidence and peace of mind. Colostrum, one of Surthrival's flagship products, is an immune-fortifying functional food that I use daily in my morning blended drinks. There's a study hosted over on PubMed called Prevention of Influenza Episodes with Colostrum compared with vaccination in healthy and high-risk cardiovascular subjects. The following is from the abstract, quote, "Colostrum, both in healthy subjects and high-risk cardiovascular patients, is at least 3 times more effective than vaccination to prevent flu and is very cost-effective," close quote. Colostrum has long been used to create a robust immune system. Additionally, check out Surthrival's other immune-building formulas like their D3K2. That's vitamin D3 sourced from lanolin and vitamin K2 from Japanese natto. Also, have a look at their reishi and chaga dual-extracted medicinal mushroom formulas. Both of these mushrooms have demonstrated immune-modulating activity. You can find a scientific literature review on chaga on the Surthrival website. Remember, a strong immune system is always your best defense. Check out the lineup at surthrival.com. Hey, I've been telling you about the WildFed TV show for several months, and in light of the recent social distancing mandates, self-quarantines, shelter-in-place orders, and other widespread COVID-19 mitigation strategies, we've decided to make episode 1 of the WildFed show free for you to watch. Head over to wild-fed.com to see episode 1. We are now streaming on Vimeo, which means you can purchase the whole season or individual episodes. Right now, the coupon code HUNKERDOWN, all one word, that's HUNKERDOWN. It is not case sensitive. Again, it's HUNKERDOWN, all one word, gets you 25% off season 1 or the season 1 and director's cut bundle package. Season 1 on its own is just over 4 hours of content, and the director's cuts are an additional 14 hours of content with some pretty in-depth discussions about the episodes themselves, plus how to employ the equipment and strategies that you see in those episodes. Again, go over to wild-fed.com to see episode 1 for free and to get links to the Vimeo pages where you can use the coupon code HUNKERDOWN for 25% off. This is an ideal time to watch the season or individual episodes, especially with the upcoming hunting, fishing, and foraging seasons all about to start. In fact, here in Maine, the Commissioner of Inland Fish and Wildlife has not only opened the open water fishing season early, normally we can't fish the open water until April 1st, but she's allowing folks to fish in the state without a fishing license through to the end of April. This is pretty unprecedented news and is part of an effort to encourage people to get outside during this pandemic. While I've never seen a move like this, I definitely agree with the spirit of her decree. Spending time outside is always a healthy choice, but now more than ever. Again, time in nature is something you can do while still observing social distancing recommendations. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. Well, I've got to admit, it was very difficult this week to pull myself away from the news of the day to listen back through today's podcast, the way I do each week before recording the show introduction. I could really see how the news about the novel coronavirus, and in particular, what really has my attention, the government response in the U.S. and abroad, has been in the forefront for me. With so much unfolding each day, it can be a challenge to put my focus in other places that nourish my mind, body, and spirit. My mind has been heavily focused on trying to gain an educated understanding of what's happening around us. I know folks on every part of the spectrum, from those who are almost completely unaware of the news, though admittedly there's a lot less of those folks this week, to those who are outright panicking, to those who don't believe a word that's coming from the CDC, the WHO, mainstream media, or the president's coronavirus task force. Now, my approach is much more agnostic. I'm simply watching these events unfold and positioning myself, my family, and my teams as best I can in these complex and acutely trying times. I've always lived like there could be a month-long quarantine at a moment's notice, so our preparedness, once something people used to tease me about, is now affording us the luxury of comfortably observing this entire process as it rolls out. As I mentioned, it was challenging for me to shift gears to revisit the topic of marine fisheries. That said, once I started listening, I was immediately enthralled and grateful for a reprieve and a reminder of the things that I love and care about: wild places and wild species, and how we humans can meaningfully interact with those places and species. I was also reminded of our role as stewards of and to those places and species, and the importance of renewing our vows constantly to live in right relationship to the rest of the natural world. It was also a very healthy, and I mean mentally and emotionally healthy, break from this rather grim news cycle. So I hope that this show can be that for you too, a break from the chaos that is our new, albeit temporary, reality. So with that said, I invite you to get lost in this conversation. You deserve it. The rest of the news will still be waiting for you when you finish. Today's guest is Robert Steneck, Ph.D. He's a professor of oceanography, marine biology, and marine policy in the School of Marine Sciences at the University of Maine. Bob's a marine ecologist whose laboratories include coastal zones in the Gulf of Maine and the Caribbean. He's published over 200 scientific papers on topics including coral reefs, calcareous algae, lobsters, sea urchins, fish, historical ecology, marine ecosystem dynamics, global climate change, ocean acidification, and the science of managing marine resources. His scientific publications have been cited over 33,000 times. I initially contacted him after seeing a TED Talk where he discussed Maine's lobster fishery. However, Maine's favorite crustacean becomes more of an anchor point that we circle around as we have a much bigger picture conversation about ocean ecology, the management of ocean fisheries, and Bob's hope for a community-based fisheries management model in the future. I think you'll immediately sense the depth of his knowledge base and experience as he talks about subject that he's unquestionably qualified to weigh in on. This interview is part of a continuation of my own personal quest to better understand the state of the Earth's oceans and its fisheries. From the moment we sat down on the porch of his seaside home with his sailboat bobbing on the undulating sea just outside, I knew we were in the presence of a person who was deeply connected to the ocean. I think you're really going to appreciate Bob's perspectives. Also, fans of 90s rap, there's a little joke tucked in here for you. Bob might have missed it, but I'm curious if you'll pick it up. We're sitting here with Bob Steneck, Ph.D. Thanks so much for having us out to your home here.
Glad to be here.
If you were sitting in front of a fellow scientist and they were asking you about this place where we are geologically, ecologically, how would you describe this part of the world?
It's really dynamic. You know, this place is on the coast of Maine. 18,000 years ago, we had 2 miles of ice over our head.
Wow.
At that point, the ice is so heavy that it's actually pushing the coast down. So when it retreated, about 12 or 13,000 years ago, the ocean was in Augusta, it's nearly the center of the state of Maine. As it continued to retreat, it got to Hudson Bay, and when that melted, that area buoyed up, and you ended up having what they call isostatic adjustment, so that George's Bank came out of the water. And George's Bank, which is 150 miles offshore.
And how deep is it to the?
Well, right now, some shallow spots are actually around, the shallowest places are about 40 or 50 feet deep. Okay. But then it drops right off on the continental shelf. But there are spruce trees out there. There are mastodon bones out there. Oh, no,
really?
Yeah. So
there were mastodons on the George's Bank.
Absolutely. And they've been dragged up by fishermen.
No.
Yeah, they got some molars. And they go, oh, how did they get a molar out here?
Wow. Okay, well, there was like a land bridge then.
Well, we call it today Cape Cod, right? But you just keep walking on the sand and you're on George's Bank when the sea level is lower. So the sea level then, of course, then that started to subside. And that's what I mean by dynamic. Sea level has been changing. As part of that change, oceanography changes. But this area, the whole North Atlantic, is actually a young ocean. It hasn't been cold for that long. It has very few species unique to the North Atlantic. Most of these species that we have came over from the North Pacific, Now, they may be a new species, but they've evolved relatively recently in the last 5 million years.
Came right up over the top?
Yes, and during interglacial periods. And so what we ended up is we got inoculated from the diverse North Pacific, but it's an incomplete inoculation, and it left us with relatively few species here. Now, I mention that because this is a highly productive system. We have got big tides. The big tides actually contribute to nutrient regeneration. We've got a lot of plankton. And so the combination of high nutrients and relatively few species should trigger something to every farmer on the planet. That is what you want in your farm, right?
Yeah.
And the things that became, you're funneling all this energy through relatively few species. So cod were hyper abundant. And as a matter of fact, for over 4,000 years, the dominant vertebrate found in the garbage heaps that we call Indian middens on the coast of Maine were codfish bones.
Yeah.
And so the very first people who came to Maine after the glacial retreat were seafood eaters. And we have isotope data to show that that's what they did. They subsisted on...
How long ago are we talking about?
Between 4,500 years ago and about 500 years ago.
It's not really that long ago.
No, it's not, and that's in part because anything that would happen earlier than that got wiped clean by the glaciers that came through.
Right.
2 miles of ice.
Ground to powder or buried, or?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, since roughly every 120,000 years we have a glacial episode, and the peopling of the Americas, it depends upon exactly who you read. Some people are pushing it back to 16,000 years ago. So my sense is that the peopling was happening during our glacial maximum. And so the people who came to the coast of Maine, probably from the west coast, they think now that they came along a maritime corridor, initially from Japan, probably along the Aleutians. Some people think that the Bering ice bridge is not as important as they used to think.
Previously thought, yeah.
And they found some coastal colonies in Chile that are 16,000 years ago.
Now, the last that I've heard was the idea that people came across down that west coast and then it did a U-turn and came up the east coast. Is that still kind of current?
Well, good question. Again, the Anasazi Indians predate anything that's here. That's inland. And so, yes, probably to some degree, we think there was hunters and gatherers that came across. But an important take-home message there is that with the peopling of the Americas was the extinction of a lot of large mammals. The mammal megafauna in North America exceeds what we have in Africa today.
I mean, unbelievable, right? 2 camels,
Yeah,
3
and
bison,
maned lions, and
giant sloths.
That's right.
Yeah.
And there isn't a good explanation for their sudden extinction other than the appearance of humans.
Anthropogenic.
So hunters and gatherers, and also the land clearing and fire and things like that they could create, did have non-sustainable results.
Yeah.
And one of the things that happens over and over again is the extinction risks are highest among the largest bodied organisms. They tend to be rather specialized. They tend to be relatively fewer in number, elephants compared to mice.
They have lower fecundity often.
That's right. And they need a fair amount of parental care, long gestation period. And the bottom line is that they usually can't sustain very high rates of adult mortality and be sustainable.
Yeah.
And so the very first wave of hunters and gatherers did an awful lot to knock out that megafauna, but that was immediately followed by agrarian practices that everybody knows about: corn, maize, how it was cultivated very early on. But the other thing that caused place-based activity for longer periods of time was fishing. And that's because per unit area, the ocean is much more productive. 1 square mile of ocean is much more productive than 1 square mile of land, almost no matter what you do to that land.
Well, it has like a 3-dimensionality to it that...
Yes, and you can see higher productivity in some tropical rainforests, but when you actually crank the numbers in terms of carbon production, no, the oceans are actually more productive. The similar factor, though, is that the average size of the cod that were being caught by Native Americans using very primitive tools.
Inshore fishing.
Inshore fishing, and we confirm that because the carbon and nitrogen isotopes are very clearly seaweed, seagrasses.
Okay.
This is inshore.
Inshore species.
Yeah.
And just for people listening, you're saying that when we look at the bones, these vertebra remains and these middens, we can look at isotopes in those and kind of get a sense of what the diet of that cod was, right?
That's exactly right. And also, by looking at the vertebral diameter, we can estimate the size.
Fish, right.
And the average size that these folks were fishing, and they were fishing with very, cordage that was probably fiber, bones that were carved out of deer bones made the hooks that they were using. So these are not strong things. Average size was 1 meter in length.
Wow.
Of the cod.
What would you guess the weight of that fish is?
Well, that's going to be I can remember catching a 40-pounder, and it was about, I think it was less than 1 meter in length.
Yeah.
And the thing is, if you've ever gone fishing for cod, you don't know if you've got a cod or a boot. It comes up pretty much like dead weight.
Yeah, once you get it off the bottom there. Yeah.
And so that actually was a real plus. And the other thing about cod is that they preserve particularly well, which is the reason why the isotope signature is so strong in humans. That meant they only have a short fishing season, but they could put away enough cod that they could subsist on it.
Yeah.
But also where I'm going with this is I think that there are also a lot bigger cod. We know that cod could get to be 200 pounds.
My goodness. But what's the biggest cod you saw out on the Bunny Clark?
I don't remember.
I've seen them get out into, if we see a 20-pound one, that's a massive cod now. That's pretty rare out there. We're going offshore out of a gunkwit.
Right.
And we can't keep them anymore, but we end up, unfortunately, bringing a lot up and throwing them back in. And I don't think there's a very high survivability to that.
The last documented 200-pound cod was caught in the 1800s.
Okay, wow.
And so just as the megafaunal decline in North America, we saw much delayed, but some of the very biggest of the food fish declining on the coast of Maine, like the cod. Mm-hmm. And of course, we also saw with whaling the decline of whales. There was a North American gray whale that went extinct. So again, the megafauna can decline, but it's a very productive system. So certain other species, a close relative to the cod is haddock, and haddock still has these explosive recruitment years where there's a lot of young that make it, and so it's one of the more sustainable ground fish.
Okay, how about the pollock?
Pollock have been holding relatively constant. It's more their market value. If you put a blindfold on, most people would not tell a pollock from a cod, but they have gray flesh, so people just don't.
Is that what it is?
I think so.
Because we catch haddock, pollock, cusk, all these gadiforms when we're out ground fishing. Cod was always king for everybody, of course, and I came into it. Sort of this hierarchy of them, and I came into it at the end of the recreational cod fishing, and for me, it's been this question of why is it so revered compared to pollock and haddock, which are also just delicious? But that's an interesting component, was the flesh color, maybe.
I think so. If you have a pollock just laying out, it's not likely to be selected the way a white cod or halibut might.
Yeah.
Were they fishing pollock back 4,500 years ago?
They would have been catching them.
They are in the middens, but not in the same numbers. And I think there was a predator-prey thing going on. I think the cod actually was the dominant predator.
Suppressing
they
the
get so big.
Yeah.
They're trophic generalists. They have a very broad range of diets. So you go through accounts and you'll find, typically when they're young, they're eating crustaceans. They start off with shrimp and then they move to crabs and lobsters. And then when they become reproductive, they start feeding on fish. But they can feed on a whole wide range of fish, and of course a large cod's got a huge mouth.
Yeah.
You find baby ducks in their stomach. Whoa. You find rocks in their stomach. I'm not making this stuff up.
So they'll come up and grab a duck.
It's hard to believe, but that is actually in one of the classic literature by Bigelow and Schroeder.
They eat lobster as well, right?
They do.
That's why Tony hates them.
Well,
we've been. It's interesting to hear what commercial fishermen have to say about different species. Some of which were commercially important to them even a decade ago or less, and now they consider them almost like a nemesis due to just the way the regs affect them. And so we've been noticing commercial lobstermen complaining about cod being in their traps from time to time and being, a predator to lobsters, as you illustrated in your TED Talk.
Yeah, they can be and are predators of lobsters. And I've seen lobsters come out of the stomach of cod. I've dissected them out. There's pretty good segregation now because where lobsters are bite-sized, they're in the coast, and cod are pretty rare on the coast. So the cod that are being fished offshore aren't coming in contact with bite-sized lobsters much anymore. But nevertheless, what has happened, though, with not just the decline of cod and other coastal species, including wolffish, but is that you now have a predator-free coastal zone where most of the baby lobsters get started. And until about 5 years ago, the greatest tonnage of anything landed on the coast of Maine was herring. And about 5 years ago, the tonnage of landed lobsters exceeded the tonnage of herring. And why that matters is that 90% of the herring goes to lobster trap bait.
When you say herring, you're talking about many species?
No, I'm talking primarily it's Atlantic herring.
Okay.
But, there are some alewives that commingle with them. And menhaden, which are called pogies locally, they have only started recently coming back into our coastal zone. They are here now. Yeah. They were here last year, but not before that. But
I've been seeing them diving lately.
Yeah, they are. They're cupelids, so they have many of the same characteristics. But by far, the most important food fish are Atlantic herring. And again, because their abundance has been declining and lobster landings have gone way up. And roughly speaking, it takes 10 pounds of bait for 1 pound of landed lobster. That means we have a real bait shortage.
Oh, my goodness.
And bait is now being imported to Maine from as far away as New Zealand.
Oh, you're kidding. What are they importing from there?
Typically, I think when they started, they were not being super careful about how they did this. So anybody who had fish racks for sale, cheap, they'd take them. Then foods, biosecurity became a bigger issue. I mean, what pathogens might be coming down? So they've really cleaned up those protocols, and they're still coming from New Zealand. And I don't know if they cook their heads first or whether it's certified pathogen-free or something like that. That's not my field, except to know that we're careful about it, but it is coming from distant sources.
I have a question I want to ask you specifically about the lobster fishery and all this bait. But first, can we back up a little bit? And I want to talk about your CV and a little bit about your background. Just a quick who you are and what you do. Your CV's got to be 10 pages long. You've had a busy career from what I can tell, and fairly illustrious what it looks like. Tell us a little bit about your background educationally and some of the work that you've been involved in.
Well, I started diving when I was 10 years old, and so I've been diving for more than half a century, and I've always been a naturalist. So I like looking at the natural world and figuring out what's going on. I've always been that way. So I went to a small liberal arts school in Ohio and had natural history classes along with other things, physiology, you name it, and that piqued my interest. I did a geology field camp and my junior year and felt, okay, I am going to be a paleontologist. And then I went down to St. Croix, where the West Indies Laboratory had summer courses, and I took a marine ecology course and a phycology course that studied algae. And the fellow there from the Smithsonian, his name was Walter Adey, he was living on a trimaran sailboat that he built in his backyard, doing Smithsonian research, and he's studying calcareous algae. And suddenly I saw a marine organism that creates rock and fossils. And he's asking me to be his technician as soon as I graduate so I can live on a sailboat down in the Virgin Islands.
Yeah.
I told him I'd get back to him. That was a no-brainer. And so for a couple of years, I was able to work with him drilling reefs. It's that's arduous work.
Drilling reef to get core samples?
Yes. It's called reef morphogenesis. How do reefs form? And it's, really since Darwin's early theories, nobody had actually looked at it, certainly not in the Caribbean. So this is 1972 to 1974 when I was doing that. And then he also said, if you've got a project, just go ahead and just pursue it on your own. And
oh, that's cool.
So I got interested in how and why this coralline algae has different morphologies, and so I transplanted this coralline to different zones and saw different morphologies. But I also found that this branching coralline only was branching within 20 centimeters of sea level, and if you transplanted it lower, it got eaten by parrotfish. Two important things were learned. One, this is a terrific fossil indicator of sea level.
Oh, yeah.
So you can do a drill, and if you find this brancher, you're within 20 centimeters of sea level,
right.
And that may have been 10,000 years ago in St. Croix, and that's very useful. Two, parrotfish are really important, and people at that time didn't know much about parrotfish. So I got very interested in plant-herbivore interactions, published that paper, and I published that before I started graduate school, and then wanted to study a different system. So I did my master's at the University of Maine and came up here to work on kelp forests, very interested in sea urchin kelp dynamics and interactions. Had a great advisor named Bob Vadas.
This is before the urchin fishery?
Way before the urchin fishery. So this is 1974. Mm-hmm. The sea urchin fishery began in 1987.
Okay.
So I was doing things like putting out strips of kelp and looking at the rates at which they would be consumed, doing that as a long and depth gradient, correlating that with the sea urchins and demonstrating that for all practical purposes, this ecosystem, which has kelp forests and has sea urchins, it has one herbivore. This is this low diversity.
Yeah.
Now, as an ecologist, having come from the tropics, I said, this is an ecologist's dream. Because every species is a variable. And what every scientist has to do is control variables. I don't have very many variables to control in Maine. One sea urchin, right? So I could do these studies, and this is pretty much the only herbivore that matters. Well, I was doing this kind of work, and then I finished my degree in 1978 and got rehired by the Smithsonian, went back down to the tropics. And then I got recruited to be a Ph.D. student at Johns Hopkins. And, so I had a full fellowship there. And Jeremy Jackson, who's a well-known ecologist, took me on as a student. And I worked in Washington State with another ecologist named Bob Payne, down in St. Croix, and in Jamaica, and then up in Maine. And so I was looking at the factors that control this calcareous algae, but many of the factors were herbivores. Mm-hmm. And so I realized that herbivory is a really important force, and it shapes landscapes. And in 1981, I got hired by the University of Maine to come up and be a professor here. And so what most people do is they just go back to doing what they know how to do best. So I'm diving, and I'm studying sea urchins, I'm studying consumption rates. And then and while I was doing that work, I was noticing all these lobsters. So I went over to Maine's Department of Marine Resources, and I said, wow, why are there so many lobsters in Maine? And the DMR biologist at the time said, well, actually there aren't. He said, our models are pretty clear. They are seriously overfished, and they are in the process of collapsing. And I said, well, I don't know anything about your models, but I'm seeing a lot of sea urchins down there. And I said, more than that, I'm seeing a ton of baby lobsters. Now, it's not rocket science, but when you look at demography someplace and you have a lot of babies and no obvious mortality of the babies, that you have a population explosion coming. And I want to know, why are there so many, and why are they doing so well, given that this is a fishery that's been targeted for 150 years?
Yeah.
And then I realized I didn't get anywhere talking to this guy because there was no research being done in situ. Nobody was diving and looking at the lobsters in their natural habitat. They were looking at landings, they were looking at sizes. They were assuming that they don't migrate. Turns out that they do. When they get bigger, they start migrating offshore, and they thought, oh, they're all just being caught. No, they're actually building up offshore, big reproductive populations. So I spent a good part of 20 years studying lobsters and initially fighting with a lot of the fisheries scientists.
At that time, how important was the lobster fishery to Maine? I mean, obviously right now it's one of the most important things going for the state, but what was it like then?
In terms of value, when you correct for inflation, even going back to 1950, lobsters were the single most valuable species to Maine's maritime economy. But there were a lot. It was shared with a lot of other species way back when.
Okay.
Cod, hake, haddock, swordfish, bluefin tuna, and of course soft-shell clams, northern shrimp, and scallops. But what has happened is roughly about 1977, with the establishment of the exclusive economic zone, when the foreign fishing fleets were thrown off of Georges Bank.
200 miles.
200-mile limit. That's right.
So countries around the world, for people listening.
They were all fishing there.
Okay, countries around the world could fish each other's waters up to what was it then?
Oh, right up to almost
a couple miles out. A few miles out.
I think state waters.
Okay, so at that time, countries started to say, okay, we're making a 200-mile border.
Right. 1977, the EEZ was established,
Okay.
And so one of the things that had been happening was cod stocks were declining on Georges Bank, but as soon as they established that, they started to recover. But then what happened was the United States built the boats that could go out there and fish, and they drove them down. But the other thing that was happening at that time was the globalization of our fisheries. And it's a really interesting concept, but you don't have to go back that far to read economists saying, most fish, because they're going to get stinky, are marketed locally. And so you only will fish to the point of economic extinction, where it's no longer valuable to be fishing that species, and you're automatically going to stop fishing because you can't make money at it. But then when we started having these globalized fisheries, so that we're selling fish caught on Georges Bank all over the world with, better transportation and refrigeration. Of course, things like the sea urchin fishery was entirely Japanese market, so there was no interest in doing anything with sea urchins. That was 10 years after the EZ. That started in 1987. And the point is that the reason why you could take a sea urchin that is mostly a hollow shell filled with seawater and some gonad. The gonads come out, and that's the uni that's marketable. Makes up about 15%.
Is that seasonal, or is that in the
it is.
animal all the time?
They have a reproductive cycle. So they initially there was no licenses. Anybody could harvest them any time of the year. It was a big mistake. The wrong time of the year, you're going to be harvesting a sea urchin. It's going to be empty.
Yeah, no value.
Just throw it away. So then they got clever. It took, I think, about 5 or 6 years before they figured that out, that there'd be a season. They didn't have any regulations, like you didn't have to be a certified scuba diver until, I think, 1 year, 6 or 7 scuba-related deaths occurred with the sea urchin fishery.
What are typical depths that they're going to?
Initially, it was very shallow because that's where they were most abundant. But they took those out very early, and then they're going to greater and greater depths. And the thing is that initially it was almost entirely scuba diving. But once the shallow zones got stripped the sea urchins, then the draggers started going. And so the fishery remains today mostly in eastern Maine, and it's mostly with draggers. But where I was going with this was this whole notion of, well, how can you make money with a spiny sea urchin that is mostly hollow, 15% of marketable gonad, harvest it, process it, ship it to the other side of the planet, and still make a profit? And it's simply because of the strength of the yen compared to the strength of the dollar. So, that...
So that can wash out that economic extinction you were talking about.
Yeah.
So something will continue to be fished when it would be economically extinct in the local area.
That's right.
If you have an exotic market that's willing to pay more money for it or has a strong currency.
That's right.
Wow.
Okay.
And, so in 1993, the second most valuable species on the in the state of Maine were sea urchins. There were 1,500 full-time sea urchin fishermen. And by full-time, it means that they only had to fish a couple of months to make plenty of money for the year.
Is there any market locally for that? Was there?
At the time, I'd say virtually none. But there is a little bit of a niche market within, Japanese sushi.
It's an acquired taste.
It is an acquired taste. I worked on sea urchins for a long, long time, and I worked with the sea urchin fishery when the state started getting serious about regulating it. There was a sea urchin zone council, and that required having, I think, 2 scientists on the board, and I was on that board when it started. So I was compelled to have to eat it on occasions, and I never liked it. And, I never pretended to like it either. But it is an acquired taste, and it is really enjoyed. But it opened up this whole concept of roving bandits. And that's because if you actually look at the history of the sea urchin fishery globally, it really started in Japan after World War II. And after World War II, the Japanese were not allowed to use their ships for anything but fishing. No military ships allowed anymore due to the Marshall Plan. And so relatively early on, within 10 years, roughly from Japan to the South China Sea, the sea urchins were gone. But by the 60s and 70s, they were fishing the entire Pacific Rim. By the 1970s, California stocks had collapsed. By 1987, they started fishing here. And by 1993, it was collapsing and has never come back. So we saw this happening, and in every place you have the Japanese market, and it just happens to be Japan. They're not the only ones that do this, but they create a monetary incentive for locals to fish, and in fact are encouraged effectively to overfish. It's like the tragedy of the commons. But at the point of overfishing, especially when you have a very strong ecosystem driver like sea urchins, you fundamentally change the ecosystem, which has happened, and then the Japanese market moves. It goes to another place, Vladivostok, Chile. And Chile has this huge undeveloped coastline down around Patagonia, and they're still fishing there. But what I documented, because I was working way before the fishery began, was the sea urchin fishery sort of becoming this herbivore exclusion experiment. It targeted our only herbivore.
Oh, right. Okay.
And suddenly the whole thing shifted to seaweed, kelp, but not just kelp. And that shift...
As being a dominant player in the ecology.
Yeah, it had been grazed and mowed down for
essentially
at least,
kept at bay.
Yeah, at least for decades. Some of the earliest reports I could get that were quantitative go back to the 1960s, where there's these vast coralline bottoms. So see, the corallines that I was studying are herbivore resistant. So this
corallines?
Yeah, that's this calcareous algae that I started studying down in St. Croix. Mm-hmm. It's incredibly abundant. If you walk around tide pools, you'll see these little patches that look like pink plaster in tide pools. Yeah, that's coralline algae. But you'd have these massive fields of it because
it's a microalgae that builds up.
No, it's actually a red alga, and it can have patches as big as a pie plate. It's a red alga, but Darwin thought it was an animal. He called it the nullipores. But it's one of the most. It's probably the most abundant organism, plant or animal, that lives on hard substrate that's illuminated within the photic zone.
Oh wow!
And where it dominates is where herbivores dominate. And herbivores were abundant when I got here, pretty much because we had long ago taken the herbivore predators out. So you have trophic generalists like cod, and they may eat sea urchins, and they'll eat crabs and lobsters, which I think is the reason why if you go through all the Indian middens in the western North Atlantic, you won't see any crabs or lobsters in any of those middens.
Oh, no way.
And I think that, and we have evidence of this, that they were actually, at the time of European contact, the nearshore coastal zone already started having depletion of cod, and that started opening the window for lobsters, so that some of the earliest people like Weymouth and Rozier in the 1500s were describing lobsters on the coast of Maine. And I think that was already a relaxation of this very inshore predation pressure that existed.
It's hard for me to picture all that cod because they're feeding on what it's like if you have that many predators on a landscape. I typically think of there being lots of herbivores and sparsely populated carnivores or predators, but this is sort of the reverse equation where you have this incredible density of predatory fish.
Right, and I think it's important to note that they are strong trophic generalists. So you have very productive waters, and so all the rivers were free and running. So you had alewife, blueback herring, mixing with Atlantic herring. You had nothing stopping the menhaden from coming into this area. You had a lot of forage fish. You had shrimp. You had northern shrimp. You had, as I said, seabirds that they apparently can eat, at least they're found in their stomachs. So the cod were really a dominant. And one of the things that I've talked to some seal experts on is it's unusual the relative rarity of seals in the Native American middens. And it's entirely possible the seals were being outcompeted by cod.
Wow.
Because the cod absolutely eat the size that the seals prefer, but they eat bigger and smaller as well, and they're not air breathers. When we had this inoculation of pinnipeds, pinnipeds would include, your traditional seals, your sea lions, fur seals, but the only ones that got here are the phosid seals, and that includes harbor seals, gray seals, ring seals, and harp seals. Why I mention that is that they typically swallow their fish prey whole. So if you think about roughly a foot-long herring, that's perfect. And they'll eat it head first. They have delicate stomach linings, and so it collapses all the spines, and they go after the menhaden too. That's perfect. But if it's a meter-long cod, they're not biters.
Right.
And so that cod is not prey for the seals, but
everything the seal eats is prey for the cod.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So all of this is getting at, a very low diversity ecosystem that's highly productive. It's taking a lot of energy and it's funneling it through relatively few nodes, and it tends towards booms and busts. So we had a ton of cod, but that's a boom. But when the cod got taken out, they funneled into this bust, and suddenly you had other things exploding in abundance, things that were formerly their prey, sea urchins, crabs, lobsters, things like that. And again, they can create this boom.
Now, okay, just to tease out these two different things, there's the anthropogenic booms and busts that happen or come from anthropogenic origins, but then you're talking about some natural cycles as well?
Well, what I'm talking about is you've got sort of an unbridled fire hose that can be locked into a particular ecosystem state, but there's not that many species holding it in that state. So if humans arrive and start targeting, well, they've targeted cod right away, but they didn't have the capacity to...
Kind of led us over here is following the cod in a way, right? Or
right. No, that's right.
A lot of the movement, yeah.
No, I mean, the very first significant export from the New World was codfish. Even though they were kind of, hey, there's gold over there, the gold never really materialized, but the cod did. And there were periods of time when there were more cod being sold in London streets from Maine than from Europe.
Okay.
And, within sight of here is some of the islands like Damer's Cove, where before Jamestown and before the Plymouth colony, the first Europeans to overwinter were the fishermen who just didn't want to have to go across the North Atlantic,
right.
Because they didn't really like being in Europe anyway, and they would just spend the winter in Maine. And that's before the Jamestown colony. But it was the cod was king, and you're not just taking out something that's good food and economically valuable. You're taking out a super ecosystem driver. So you lose that controlling influence, and prey species respond. And some of those prey species are ecosystem passengers, and others are ecosystem drivers. I would argue the lobsters are ecosystem passengers. They actually profit from some of these changes, like the loss of predators. But they don't. But controlling lobsters doesn't change the ecosystem.
Oh, okay.
Sea urchins, those are ecosystem drivers.
Because of their herbivory.
Because of their herbivory. And so when they grew up in abundance, they took out the kelp, they took out the seaweed. That's taking out primary producers to a large degree. It's changing the habitat. We have a lot of ledge. Lobsters typically don't like hanging out in ledge unless there's no predators around. And so when the kelp became abundant, it just kind of carpets the seafloor. There are places where you can dive and you just see the antenna coming out from under the kelp. And it's an amazing abundance of lobsters that we have. Again, booms and busts. I was quantifying lobster densities every summer between 1989 and 1999. And we were getting average population density of 2 lobsters per meter square.
Wow.
That's the highest population density of lobsters on the planet. And that's
when was this?
This was between 1989 and 1999.
Okay.
And the research I just got funded is for the next couple of years is to go back to those sites.
Okay.
Now, 20 years later. But where I'm going with all this is that booms and busts in a low diversity system. You just go over to Europe. They have many more species over there. Many more crabs. They've got 2 clawed lobsters, if you count what we call nephrops. It's their prawn. But if you take all...
In similar latitude to
well,
us?
they're actually a little bit farther north, but
Okay.
Because of the Gulf Stream, it's the same temperature, roughly.
Okay, yeah.
So the European lobster goes from roughly Gibraltar in the Mediterranean all the way up to Iceland. And if you add up all the landings in a given year, it's less than landings in Maine in Penobscot Bay.
Wow.
So, we've got this incredibly high population density of lobsters. And, many people would say, God, this is really great. Today, the lobster from Maine is the single most valuable species to the fisheries of North America.
Is it really?
So you've got, 5 species of salmon in Alaska. If you put them together, they're probably worth more. But for a single species, nothing is more valuable than the Maine lobster.
No kidding.
And today it makes up 80%, a little bit less this year, of our total marine resource value. And the problem is, this is what I call a gilded trap in the sense that, we have all kinds of different traps. People know about poverty traps. Once you get into a trap, it's hard to get out. The gilded trap is where something is economically valuable and profitable, so it seems like a big success. But the risk of being with a lucrative monoculture is being undervalued. We're very good at estimating the cost of things, and we're much poorer at estimating the risk of things. I mean, if people could really evaluate risk well, there'd be no lottery.
Right.
But the fact is that we now are so much at risk in that almost 80% of all the value comes from one species. The second most valuable species is herring. That's completely going to, not completely, but 90% is going to the lobster fishery.
My goodness.
Beyond that,
its economic value is that it is bait for lobsters.
Yes.
So it's all part of the same economy.
And that could be turned around if lobsters disappeared tomorrow, but still it would make up no more than just a couple % of the current value that we have. So with scallops that are doing better, but still it's just a couple %, it's many people don't realize that even though there's 36 species that the Maine Department of Marine Resources keeps track of in terms of their economic value, I think only about 3 of them are more than 1% of the value.
Oh, yeah, okay. I've just been reading the Seaweed Chronicles by Susan Hand Shetterly, new book she's written. And she's talking a lot about eating down the food chain, she calls it. And it's like something that I feel like you were also talking about here. It's almost like fishery by fishery, we've kind of collapsed them down, right? Like dominoes. And have we
is this too simple to say, but it's almost like what we've got left are like the arthropods at the bottom. I mean, have we fished it down to where what's left are essentially like kind of the bugs, and now we're celebrating that?
Well, to a degree. I mean, there is a big ecological literature about fishing down food webs. And, as we said, the really big things, prehistoric people were going after those. And we've just continued to take out the big things. So we had a planet that was dominated by sequoias, and today we have a planet dominated by weeds.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
And one could say, but that our breadbasket, those are mostly weeds, right? I mean, we don't make flour from trees, right?
Yeah, from annual plants.
So there is an element of increased sustainability at lower trophic levels, so moving in that direction is a plus. And I think, of course, there's always been a lot of interest in aquaculture. There's been a lot of interest in a lot of research dollars, but so far in cold water, especially in Maine, the economic value exists only for high value, for lack of a better term, boutique species that can make it to market in just a couple of years. Salmon, oysters, really successful. Most other types of aquaculture have not been a biological problem to produce, but their business plan has succeeded. Most recently they're trying to raise scallops in aquaculture, and I hope it works. But when you look at what a good day, a single day for a scallop dragger brings in, and you think about what would be involved in growing that many scallops, good luck with that. And the same is true for sea urchins. They've tried that. Kelp and other seaweed is now a biggest growth industry, actually, in terms of aquaculture. But the market, the value is very low. Currently, it's just a couple $1 million. And so many places are growing it that I just wonder whether we really have the economic depth to make that a
to
big
support
growth
all those
industry. I think it's great to do it, but
Okay.
I just wonder how far that can go.
What do you think about, there's a few questions, a few directions I want to go, but I want to go back to something I heard you say in one of your videos. You were talking about, you described something as a functionally domesticated landscape.
Yeah, and that's what I've been describing for right here, right? I mean, what do? You take out the predators. We've discussed that. You add bait. Well, we're bringing bait in as far away as New Zealand, to feed this crop. We don't seed the crop. That's true. That's naturally produced. And I think the three big things...
Did we mess with that? We did mess with some hatchery lobsters at one point, no?
Right, and none of them have succeeded. I mean, there's at least a century of data. So trying to replenish depleted stocks in the ocean, I can't think of an exception to all those attempts have pretty much been failures. Interestingly, I mean, they started up some hatcheries and they found lobster abundances were increasing, but then they went to areas where they weren't doing any releases and they were increasing there too. So when you do it relative to a control, they're not seeing an effect.
Okay.
Rhode Island, they have, and we've been watching climate change a lot, but Rhode Island is a lot warmer than the Gulf of Maine. It's a different ocean system. 1998 was the warmest year on the planet. A shell disease that had been around for decades broke out and created an 80% decline in the lobster stocks in Rhode Island. It has not recovered, but it's not for want of trying, because they did try hatchery efforts to get them back. No. The environment controls so much, and whether it's the right climate, the right predators or absence of predators, the right feed. When they come together, it's an enormous force, but trying to engineer that has not, in cold salt water, has not proven to be...
Not as successful as it's been on land anyway.
No, that's right.
Have Maine lobsters seen any diseases?
Yeah, they do, and they continue to, but at least in Maine, the percentage, and the worst years I heard in southern Maine, over by Kittery, they were getting about 4% of the lobsters showed shell disease. But by and large, that has not yet raised its ugly head. And it worries me a lot.
But when you're monoculture, wow.
Exactly. You're not only a monoculture, but high population densities of any organism should be a blinking red light.
Yeah. Yeah, because our experience, I've gone out to do some commercial lobstering, just dabbling in it, and getting to be a third man on a boat. But I started to ask myself, and I know it's not easy to draw clear distinctions now between what is a wild food and what's a domesticated food. Right. There's a lot of blurry lines, like unlike maybe 10,000 years ago or something. But to me, it seemed like almost like a CAFO. It's like we're dumping all this fish down in here. And then, all of, like you've said, what's left is essentially these lobsters. And are we not just feeding them and creating this massive lobster population and then tending it in a way?
Yeah, I think the three things that I think really contribute to the high populations that we have start with the conservation ethic within the fishery, which really evolved in the 1930s. And what that means is that they don't take short lobsters, they don't take egg-bearing lobsters, they put a notch in their tail if they're egg-bearing, and they can't be harvested as long as they have that notch. That's really important. Temperature is really important for the settling lobsters, and we happen to be in a climate sweet spot. And we've removed the predators. And those three things can alone describe why the Maine lobster fishery, or the lobster fishery of the western North Atlantic, is the only fishery on the planet that's been harvested for 150 years and is doing better today than ever before. Those three things together. Because you had two of those three things down in Rhode Island, but the climate went south and the disease broke out. So those are really important points, but they're not unique to the ocean, right? I mean, the potato famine in Ireland was really bad because they had found the exact type of potato they wanted, and they created a monoculture, and it suffered a disease. So the challenge is how we diversify our portfolio. For no matter what it is, you really want to have a diverse portfolio.
How would you like to see that happen?
Hey, we'll get right back to the interview in a moment, but first, domesticated, civilized living restricts the natural movement of your human body, forcing you daily into chairs, cars, and rigidly defined pathways. But when we head out onto wild landscapes, we carry these dysfunctional, domesticated movement patterns with us. MoveNat is a natural movement system that trains you and your body to move like a human animal again. Are you interested in building natural movement skills that'll improve your physical capability in the field and in everyday life? MoveNat's new Level 1 Fundamentals e-course is structured to help you re-educate your body using practical, natural movements that enhance fitness, function, and physical capabilities, all from the convenience of your home. Learn to move the way nature intended. I attended MoveNat's Level 1 and 2 trainer certification courses a few years back and came away with practical knowledge and skills that I use every day and that have changed the way I train and move across the landscape, vastly improving my overall mobility, coordination, and fitness. This new e-course is movement-rich with clear instruction. Its progression-focused methodology takes you from restorative mobility exercises to challenging movements. All ability levels are welcomed and accounted for. Enroll now at wild-fed.com/MoveNat for instant access to the full e-course. Again, that's wild-fed.com/MoveNat, MoveNat. Again, wild-fed.com/MoveNat for instant access to the full e-course containing 16 classes designed to be followed over 4 weeks with specific and measurable movement goals for each week. The course is self-paced and you'll receive lifetime access. MoveNat. I can personally recommend it. It's a fitness and movement system that's designed for the wild. Now, back to the show.
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, they're really doing fisheries management in some good and creative ways in Maine. Scallops got completely over-harvested, and the Department of Marine Resources came up with a plan when they realized from genetics that these large bays like Goldsboro Bay and Dyard Bay and Cobscook, these are all embayments in Maine that have sufficient genetically distinct scallops. They're not different species, but what it suggests is that they're a self-perpetuating population. In other words, they can spawn there, they can raise this. That means that they can go bay by bay, and they can let enough scallops reproduce, and have juveniles settle and grow out. And when they get to a certain size, then they can harvest to a certain quota. And that's what they're doing in Maine. And they're also very cleverly lining up the end resources so that you can contact a company in Maine that will ship you freshly caught scallops, and they'll tell you who the fisherman was, the day it was caught, and they'll charge you more. It's never been frozen, does not have water injected into it, and it's superior quality. So there's value added, there's sustainability. The scallop fishery, I think, is the best managed fishery we have.
Feeling good about it. What about are you talking about divers? Are you talking about draggers?
Draggers.
What impact are they having at this point, and has it changed over the years? I only hear negative things about draggers and their impact on the bottom.
Well, it is tough. So. It is tough on the seafloor, and depending upon the habitat, if it's completely a sediment habitat, which is what scallops prefer, the impact of dragging is not as lasting as it is where you have critters like some of the deep sea corals that can be hundreds or even thousands of years old. They grow very slowly. They can't be dragged at all, and so there are areas that are protected from that. Dragging is not as user-friendly a way of harvesting as, for example, diving is. If you can get population densities up to the point where diving becomes economically feasible again, that's a much better way to go. Mm-hmm. But just like with the sea urchins, it started out with divers, and today it's mostly, not entirely, but mostly draggers.
What do you see the future looking like, I guess 10, 50, 100 years out? Here, I mean, one thing I hear all the time is the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than any waters in the world. Is that true? Do you think that's true? And how soon will that start to impact? Like, will our lobster fishery have to start moving north? Will it move into Canada? I know that we're having range expansions of more southerly fish up here now.
All
I've
true.
been out fishing for tog in Maine. So yeah, what do you see happening here?
Well, the global trend is that it's the poles that are warming fastest. Tropics are not changing that much. And so in that we're cold water, yes, all the cold water areas, North Pacific and North Atlantic, are warming faster than areas farther to the south. Gulf of Maine is clearly warming, and it's warming at a fairly good clip. You look at Maine Department of Marine Resources, they have temperature data going back to 1905. And it's a pretty unmistakable positive trend of warming temperatures. One of the warmest, fastest warming bodies of water, there's a lot of, some people look at the exact cherry picking of points that gave that curve. But, the overall bottom line is, yes, it's warming relatively rapidly. Temperature really is a big driver of biogeography, among ecologists, the nerdy thing to say is thermogeography drives biogeography. and so we're losing things like northern shrimp. It's Pandalis.
Our fishery's closed.
It's closed. Pandalis borealis, and borealis is, means northern. And so that fishery is doing well in Newfoundland, but it's not doing well in Maine.
Okay.
But on the other hand,
we didn't overfish it then, is it a combination?
I really don't think it's overfishing.
Okay. It's shifting because of temperature.
Right.
Wow.
And so, because actually that was a fishery that was monitored fairly carefully in a rather sophisticated way, for one of the first, where they would take these test tows, look at the density, look at how many are egg bearing, and come up with an estimate about how big the landing should be. And then it was in recent years with warming, especially with the ocean heat wave that hit in 2012. This year is maybe just second to 2012 for warmth. And that, as it filters down to the seafloor, is an important distinction to make. The very warm temperatures are sea surface temperatures. So from Penobscot Bay down to Cape Cod, the water doesn't mix, so the surface waters can get very warm. That doesn't necessarily translate to the seafloor, but the seafloor has been warming, nowhere near as fast as the surface water. That has pros and cons. Some of the increases in lobsters, especially in eastern Maine, is because of tidally mixed water that's warming, that's increasing their nursery habitat. But other things like the northern shrimp are disappearing. However, you said tog, also black sea bass, red hake. Occasionally will hear about blue crabs. There's no reproduction going on here, but there's been some movement. So we do think that and squid, for example, they do very well with warm temperatures, high value species. So one could point out that if you just look at water temperatures in the North Atlantic, including the east coast of North America, the number of species increases as you go further to the south in warmer and warmer temperatures. Well, those warm temperatures are coming up here, so the number of species coming up here is increasing. And, other people will say, well, cod might be leaving, and that might be true, but we might be seeing other species coming in. The question is there a way we can nurture these other species? Is there a way we can harvest them sustainably? And right now, what has happened since 1995, as the lobster fishery was exploding, but everything else was declining, they had to make the decision in the Department of Marine Resources that you can't let anybody who wants to harvest lobsters go for harvesting lobsters. They basically froze the fishery, and when so many licenses retire, then you can, after you put your name into a lottery, get your name picked, and you can join this fishery. As a matter of fact, since 1995, the total number of licenses in Maine have declined as the population has gone up.
Really?
Now, the lobstermen think that's wonderful, but when you talk to lobstermen, you say, we really are in a dangerous place here. They say, yeah, I know, especially the old timers. They remember going for all these different species. Those species have disappeared. They no longer have a record of fishing for ground fish, so they lost their ground fishing licenses. So you say, gee, black sea bass is a really high value species, and it's coming up in abundance. Actually, Acadian redfish are coming up in abundance. Halibut are coming up in abundance. They say, yeah, but I can't fish for them because I've got a lobster license and I don't have
halibut are coming up in abundance?
Yeah, halibut are in eastern Maine for sure. In the last decade, they've been coming up.
The boat we fish on said they've landed more this year than they've landed in
And where were you fishing out of?
Ogunquit, out of Perkins Cove.
Right, and so I'm talking to guys out of Jonesport who are doing very well with halibut. I mean, the quota is smaller than they think it should be. So that's a plus. But unless you've maintained a federal permit for groundfish, you can't fish for them. And people who fish for groundfish can't fish for lobsters. And we describe these as kind of silos. And those silos are an impediment to ecosystem-based management. Everything we're talking about here is, could we manage the ecosystem better so that it would be more diverse and more sustainable for the entire the health of the maritime heritage? I mean, that is what is at stake here. If anything happens to the lobster today, we are going to see rapid gentrification of the coast. We're not going to see, you can hear the lobster boats right now. They're going to be gone. The co-ops will have been sold to people who really love that coastal property. This is a serious problem because the maritime heritage goes all the way back to the first people who came to the coast of Maine, who subsisted on seafood, and it could all come to a stop in a decade if this fishery has a hiccup. And the best hedge against that kind of worst case scenario is diversification. But diversification without rethinking how we do the licenses, so that you actually, I would love to see people have multi-species licenses that are confined to a space so that there's a disadvantage to fishing out their space. This is what they do in Chile.
Can you give me like a more, let's personalize the example, like Jimbo's got a boat. He's on the coast out here by Damariscotta somewhere.
Yep.
What does his license allow him to do? Like, what would that look like? Your sort of dream.
Are you talking about the way it exists?
No, like your dream management scheme. Like, how would that look?
The dream management would be, Jimbo would be part of a community.
Okay.
And the community would be fixed to a space. And the outer limit of that space would be the coastal shelf. So roughly what the fishermen call the 50-fathom ridge. if you look historically, that's really where all the cod were. You go off the 50 fathom ridge, there's different species, it's deeper water, different dynamics. So it's a certain stretch of the coast out to the 50 fathom ridge or 100 meter depth, and you would have a multi-species license, and working in a co-management way with the Department of Marine Resources, you would determine what the quota has to be for the different species. And it's not just literally what you need here. You need to have some sense of how nursery habitats and spawning aggregation sites preserve taxa for other areas.
So you'd have, so the management plan or the quotas would be based on those different communities. They wouldn't be statewide the way many are now.
Right. And so one of the things that I'm working with the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, and they are trying to do experimental research in eastern Maine, roughly from Penobscot Bay to the Canadian border. That would be the space. And trying to see if we can develop a plan for conservative harvesting in that area. The profits of reaping the benefits of strong conservation would be maintained by the fishermen in that area.
It's kind of like how a river or lake is regulated.
That's right. And water is regulated actually out west. My brother's a hog farmer in Colorado, and the people upstream of him have a quota for the water so that he doesn't get starved of water where he is. But that's right. And those kind of arrangements on how you partition this, it's not impossible because we've done this. We've done this on land. Land has private property, so it's a little bit easier in some ways. This is common property, so we have that challenge. But communities, when it works to everybody's mutual benefit to do something in a way, which I think the lobster fishery has demonstrated a history of doing. Eleanor Ostrom won a Nobel Prize in economics for her work on collective actions, which are collective actions of communities towards sustainability. And she used the Maine lobster fishery as one of her prime examples. Okay. And it's a good example, but it's only one species. Mm-hmm. So can you extend that kind of collective action to an ecosystem? And that if is a very big if. We don't know the answer yet. I have to say that when I was in the Sea Urchin Zone Council, I was working with lobstermen during the day, and then at night we'd have zone council meetings, and some of the people who were fishing for lobsters were lobstermen. And yet the idea and tradition of sustainability didn't transfer to the sea urchin fishery.
Yep.
I had some of these guys say, what are we saving them for? That's the same question in the 1920s lobstermen were saying. Mm-hmm. But between 1920 and 1940, lobster stocks in Maine crashed. And what Jim Atchison, an anthropologist, was able to do is he went through letters that they sent to the Maine Department of Marine Resources with wives and lobstermen saying, too many people are taking illegal and short lobsters. We're doing this to ourselves. And the lobster fishery was sort of like the drunk who wakes up in the gutter and realizes he's got to change his life. Mm-hmm. And that happened in that period between 1920 and 1940. And during that time, the V-notch law was already in place, but it started getting actually used. The people were scrubbing reproductive lobsters. They stopped doing that.
Just for people listening, the V-notch is something cut into the tail segment of a female lobster who's egg bearing, so that she won't be harvested at least until she molts that, right?
Right, and she can release the eggs, but as long as it has that notch, because
she's a breeder.
Right.
And then scrubbing is when she's all egged and she's got all her eggs
on her tail.
Yeah, and they scrub those off so that they can pass her off as a non-reproductive lobster.
Exactly right.
Okay.
And actually during that time. Around that time is when the maximum size was put into place. Now, these are really good ideas. I mean, lobsters, many people don't realize, lobsters can live to be 100 years old. Most
they
lobsters
just keep growing the whole time, huh?
Yeah, and so the largest lobster on record is about 50 pounds. And I've seen them.
Grant, you're all.
It's making me hungry.
No, they're huge. At home, I've got a claw that is bigger than a pie plate. Wow. And I've seen these really big lobsters in my work and also from submarines. But in that you can only harvest a lobster that is 3 1/4 inches to 5 inches on the carapace. From 5 inches to the maximum size that a lobster can get could be a 60-year reproductive life. So that just builds up and builds up. And so
so it's like if he can escape, she can escape long enough,
right,
she can get to that point where she's no longer like a viable catch.
That's right. And fisheries
you
biologists
can run long enough.
fisheries biologists call this fishing, you fish a slot.
Yep.
And many people have pointed out, like stripers were in a serious collapse until they developed a slot, so that juveniles couldn't be landed and then jumbos couldn't be landed. So you maintain your reproductive individuals. Now, you actually have to have a healthy population to fish a slot. But it would be great if we actually had the kind of control that would allow populations to grow so that you could literally, all the fisheries would be fishing a slot. So the reproductive cod would not be the first things that are taken. Now you have to realize that almost all of the fish that are caught by nets, the nets are regulated to let the young out. So you are targeting the biggest individuals. If you want to maintain a stable reproductive population, you want and need those big individuals.
Right.
So we have to do things differently. We have to fish differently. And the tragedy of the commons keeps showing up because every individual who goes out fishing doesn't think he or she is doing that much damage, but you multiply times the number of people fishing the same stock, and the damage starts building up, and that's the tragedy of the commons. And the one incentive might be if you had a better way of taking stock of what you have, and if everybody in the community knew what you have, and they could see where the limits are, pretty much like what we're doing with scallops today, but multiplied by a number of species. Could we turn the corner and start seeing multiple species fish sustainably forever? That's a question. That is ideal.
I would really like to see that. It's a scary time, I think, for me. I'm somebody who learned to fish as an adult, and all the fish I eat primarily, occasionally being out at a restaurant, but otherwise the stuff I catch. And I'm curious. It's a scary time in the sense that I'm watching, or in my lifetime, the collapse of so many fisheries, at least the functional collapse of them.
That's right.
Are there any takeaway points you have for people who are recreationally fishing or fishing for subsistence, or do you think that those folks aren't having as significant enough of an impact? Kind of, how do you see that?
There have been some studies that have actually asked that question. Because I think the mindset prior to those studies was recreational fishing just doesn't have that much of an impact until they really looked at it. And then they started realizing, yes, it actually does have an impact. Certainly in some cases, a famous paper done on the Florida fisheries. Recreational fishing is a very big deal there.
Huge there.
But, you have a couple of refugia where cod are abundant because they can't be easily harvested, places like Cassius Ledge, and yet the day boats could go out there. It's a long haul, but the cod fishing was really quite good. And so areas that weren't excluded by topography were targeted by recreational fishing. So I think we should be thinking about the stocks holistically. It should include recreational and commercial fishing. And I think we have to have a better sense of where the limits are. I will say that for some species, not all, especially not deep water species, but your ability for catch and release is certainly much better with the recreational fishery. But you have big midwater trawlers that might be going for herring, but they have a lot of bycatch, which by regulations will have to go overboard, and it goes overboard dead. So it's not brought to market. There's been a lot of debate about what to do about that. And there have been discussions with catch shares, which is a quota system, on how to create incentives to minimize undesirable bycatch. And fishermen may complain about some of these things. For example, if there's a very, very limited quota on cod and they're commingling with haddock, for which you have a good quota, you string a net and you catch haddock and cod, and the cod get caught in, are included in your quota, it becomes what they call a choke species. So you have to stop fishing.
Yeah.
Because the quota is so small for cod. Look, these are really difficult questions, and part of the problem is that we need almost near real-time, high spatial resolution data, and good luck with that.
Yeah.
And so, are there data poor ways, catch per unit of effort? If you're fishing for X number of hours, and people have done a lot with, the hook hours and catch rates as a crude indication of abundance, so that if you have hook and line fishing is a really good way to go. And if you are falling below a set rate, you actually have to stop, let those stocks rebuild. And that can be done in a very good spatial way. You have to have a community that, that discusses things with each other. You have to have social connectivity.
What's it going to take? And for because there's going to be, the community has to have a level of ecological education in addition to having the desire that you're talking about. Also, what has to happen with Department of Marine Resources on how much institutional inertia is there, and to make that course change you're describing in your sort of optimal schema for management, like what has to change? It must be dramatic.
First of all, I'd say that I think the Department of Marine Resources would not disagree in concept with almost anything that I've said, but they have the charge of having to make it real. And, then that talks about, what's enforceable, and how do you make these things work? That's tough. But we're not talking about management with the exclusion of the managers and policymakers. We're talking about co-management.
Yeah.
And I do think that it's going to have to be a type of trial and error, but it's not impossible. And there are places, I mentioned Chile is a place where they have hundreds of coletas that are stretches of the coast that are owned by a community. There's a Chilean abalone, which is not related to abalone, called loco. And the loco fishery is delicious. It's a wonderful, it gets to be about the size of a pie plate.
They die for it?
It's on their coast. They also can dive for it, but it's intertidal also. And once they had their community in control of it, they had an incentive not to fish it. And not only were they convinced that they had to get up to 100 millimeters to be reproductive, so they left them alone till they got to that size, but they're also cognizant of the value. So if the pesos per kilo is too low, the price per pound is too low, they just don't fish. Mm-hmm. Then they wait for that to come up, then they'll fish. But they can only do that because they have exclusive rights, and this is called territorial use resource fishing. I use turfs all the time, but I don't often say it. But the point is that with that, you have that incentive not to overfish, because this is your territorial area. Yeah. And they've extended that now offshore for the small boats and the big boat fleets as well. But that gets us back to the starting ideals about, are there incentives out there to fish more sustainably in ways that you conserve the biodiversity, you conserve resource value, you conserve local communities, humans are part of this ecosystem. That concept seems to be working in Chile. They're showing the value increasing since they've established that. The abundances have been increasing. It's not a panacea. There are no panaceas, but it is a way we can nudge our beleaguered ecosystems in the right direction, I think.
I'm going to ask you the same question, kind of the same question, two different ways. The first way would be, if you had a magic button that you could push that would make commercial fishing go the way. Let me try. It's such a delicate thing, and I can picture the pitchforks and torches outside, depending on how you answer this. But to make commercial fishing go the way that market hunting went, market hunting on land got to the point where, obviously we saw it happen to bison. We saw it happen to the passenger pigeon. And so now market hunting is largely illegal in North America. If you could push a magic button and you didn't have to deal with where's people's calories going to come from, let's say we've solved that problem, do you think commercial fishing can ever be sustainable, or would you make it go away?
No, I think it can be sustainable. The things going in its advantage are the much higher rates of primary productivity that exists in the ocean than exists on land.
Okay, that makes sense, yeah.
Almost all land productivity is limited by one thing: water.
Yep.
We have water.
Yep.
71% of the planet is water. But it also includes light. And if I was to wave a magic wand, I'd say nobody can fish below, about 100 meters water depth, because that's all mining down biomass. They grow
that's an interesting
slowly.
way to say that.
There's orange roughy that have been consumed recently that were born when Abraham Lincoln was born.
You could sit down to that meal without any deep respect. You would know. So if you sat me down to a meal and you said, hey, this is 5 times older than you, it's wow. I mean, I'm going to take pause before I take a bite.
Yeah, and I wouldn't take a bite. I also spent a lot of time in the tropics. I've still been working in coral reefs ecosystems, and been working on what the ecosystem drivers there are. The research that I've done with some colleagues have caused parrotfish that are very important ecologically, because they clean the reef and it's good for the baby corals, and the corals help recover from things like bleaching events after El Niños. Well, parrotfish fishing has been banned in Bermuda, Belize, Bonaire, Dominican Republic, Turks and Caicos, the Bahamas, and that's science-based regulations that protect an ecosystem driver.
Yeah.
So identifying in complex ecosystem where the pressure points are and being ultra conservative about them is really important. That's certainly one step. That's one way that science can inform policy. And frankly, I like working on these countries in the Caribbean. It's a lot easier to make your case in Belize or in Bonaire than in Washington, D.C.
No kidding, yeah.
But what works there is because you're talking to a community that's in touch with the ecosystem, and they nod their head and they know what you're talking about. So reconstructing that tight level of what we call social connectivity, the way information flows among people, the collective knowledge of people that might be 5th generation fishers, and the people who fish right within a half mile of where we're sitting. Some of these guys are in their 80s and they're still fishing, and they can remember when it was season after season after season of different things they went for. Lobsters was one season.
Oh, yeah.
And lobsters have become it.
The season.
And the younger fishermen, you have to realize lobster fishery in Maine has hit a record almost every year since 1985.
Okay.
So you've got these guys who are not young, who have never in their lifetime seen the fishery decline.
Right.
There's
an infinite growth paradigm.
Right. And so and actually, you talk to Carl Wilson at Maine's Department of Marine Resources, he'll say, V-notching is getting a little bit less common because these guys say, why bother? These lobsters are everywhere.
So they're falling out of compliance.
The older guys are, it used to always be voluntary, and then everybody was V-notching. Now it's actually mandatory. Of course, nobody's watching over everybody's shoulder, and there are fewer people V-notching. There's still a lot of V-notch lobsters out there. There's no question about it. But what I'm getting at is that it's a very complicated way. It's a dance that's complicated between an ecosystem that's complex and surprises us, and a human system, which is part of that ecosystem, that is complex and surprises us. And the surprises are are sometimes local, but more often are not. I mean, the Great Recession had a huge impact on our fisheries because suddenly people decided they didn't really need their luxury foods. And the lobster fishery took a big hit. There was a glut of lobsters. That price per pound dropped.
You're talking about 2008?
I'm talking about 2008, 2009.
Yeah.
The ocean heat wave almost did really the same thing because you had molting happening in April when the domestic market was low. So we actually had a hard time with our domestic market. And so those are two different things. The ocean heat wave was the environment surprising us. The Great Recession was our economy surprising us entirely.
Human system.
Entirely human system.
Yep.
Both of those affected the economics of lobstering. Both of those threatened the maritime heritage here. And these are so how do you manage something where you have to expect the unexpected? And again, diversifying your portfolio, having local control, which is putting fingers really on the pulse of the local fishery. What's happening in Western Maine, what's happening in Casco Bay may not reflect what's happening in Machias Bay.
Mm-hmm.
The Machias Bay fishermen know what's going on. In 2012, we had this ocean heat wave. I had lobstermen calling me, and they said, hey, lobsters are molting in April. I've never seen this. I've been fishing for 50 years. And as soon as they told me...
They normally molt when?
They normally molt around the 4th of July, sometimes in June, really not often in May, and never in April. Mm-hmm. And so I said, well, what depth were you getting them from? He said, deep. I said, whew, we're getting a warm pulse in deep water. I got in touch with the leading physical oceanographer who studies, three-dimensional oceanography in the Gulf of Maine. She did not know of any anomaly at that point. The fishermen were on top of this oceanographic event before the oceanographers were. Now there's been papers written about it. It's the ocean heat wave. From Wilmington, Delaware to Ellesmere Island, there was this thermal anomaly. The Gulf Stream had a big shift, and it affected what went on here. But my point is that the fishing community is not the last. They're the first to know about it.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of...
But there has been a classic antagonism between the regulators and the fishermen. Or am I mistaken in my assumption of that?
Whoever embraces regulators. But...
Warren G. did.
But I would say it's healthier in Maine than most places. Because the Department of Marine Resources listens to and works with the fishing industry. They democratize the fishing industry. This setting up of the 7 zones. Each zone has a representative. The representatives get together in Maine's Department of Marine Resources to discuss the lobster aspects. But there's other organizations for groundfish and for sea urchins. They share that information. So there's evolving co-management. Really, the fishing community was upset when they closed the scallop fishery. But then, with limited openings, with the new rules of engagement being, we'll let you fish, but there's going to be a quota. Take it or leave it. And they say, okay, we'll take it. Mm-hmm. And they fish, and they say, okay, you got to stop now. And then they had good landings, and they said, okay, this works. And as I said, people got interested in marketing this local resource and got value added there. And I'd say, when I talk about this and people say, well, you're talking about groundfish being some panacea, but price per pound of even the best isn't anything close to lobsters. So how does this work? And I said, you're right. But on the other hand, if we could take advantage of a very little understood fact that today 90% of the seafood that's consumed in the United States comes from outside the United States. Most people sitting down at a seafood place in Wilmington, Delaware would be shocked to learn that. Mm-hmm. Or legal seafoods, mm-hmm. And if you say, okay, that's the case, but we have an avenue of seafood that we know is locally sourced. We know who fished it. It's going to cost more. Are you in? I think we'd have a market. Mm-hmm. And I think people would say, yes, you get cod. Most of the cod you get in New England is from Iceland. Mm-hmm. How about if it came from, Muscongas Bay?
Yeah.
So I don't know if it would solve the problem, but it would be a step in the right direction to add value to locally sourced, sustainably harvested seafood.
Now is definitely the time in history where there's the most support for that kind of an idea, or at least in recent history.
Yeah, I mean, and from a lot of places, Monterey Bay Aquarium coming up with seafood guides. New England Aquarium does too. Carl Safina's organization does as well. So, and that is because I can't tell you the number of times I've given talks on this subject, and people say, well, what is that we can do? And I say, educate yourself. Mm-hmm. There are good and less good choices that you can make when you go to the grocery store or when you go to a restaurant. And I think that there is a subset, it's not everybody, but a subset of people who really care about that.
Mm-hmm. A lot of them listening right now. I mean, this is an audience of people who do care about that. I mean, I think representing a small but growing part of the population for sure.
Yeah, and you have the Marine Stewardship Council, it's global. Fisheries, for example, the lobster fishery in Belize is certified. The lobster fishery in Maine is on the cusp, but some of the things are serious problems that relate to entanglement with whales and things like that, which are serious problems, have to be dealt with. It's also possible that ecosystem change is making the right whale issue less of a Maine problem.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's a serious problem because of lack of calves and 17 deaths last year. But the copepods that they really seek are becoming rare in the Gulf of Maine. And that's climate change. And they're more abundant in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And so the rerouting of right whales out of the Gulf of Maine, they are still in harm's way. Mm-hmm. But they are...
For people who don't know why they're in harm's way, could you just explain a little bit about the entanglement issue and what goes on here?
Well, they're in harm's way for a couple reasons. Many people think the biggest is ship strikes. The right whale is a right whale because when it's dead, it floats, and it floats so high that when you come up to a right whale, and I've seen quite a few right whales in my life in the Gulf of Maine, they look like a floating island. They're sitting out of the water. There's so much blubber, but that blubber is what made them valuable during the whaling.
If you're familiar, Grandpa, they called them the right whale because they were a whale that when you killed them, they didn't sink. Obviously, that's a huge issue in the whaling days. So floating whale is important.
Okay.
Yeah,
right,
so
as
the
in
the correct whale to kill. Yeah.
And these are whales that are relatively shallow. They're relatively low in abundance. They're very selective on the foods that they have to eat. As big as they are, 60-foot whale, nevertheless. They're looking for, high lipid copepods, Calliniston marcticus, and climate change can change. The total biomass of the copepods could be the same, but the high value ones might be less, and smaller ones that are less valuable for their diet might be more, and they go to where the food is. It's, it's the old Willie Sutton rule of ecology. Why do you rob banks? That's where the money is.
That's where the money is.
Well, why do they go to Newfoundland? That's where the food is.
That's where the copepods are.
As they do that, they actually get a little bit out of our area, but they are certainly still in line for ship strikes. But their tail gets entangled, and there's been one documented case of entanglement in Maine, but Maine's not the only place that has this problem.
This is entanglement with lobster trap.
With lobster lines, and so there's been changes to float line versus sinking line. There've been changes in terms of how many traps you have with relatively fewer buoys.
Breakaway.
They tried breakaway technologies, but had its own problems because they break away when they go around a rock. They're talking about having acoustic signals, which most people think is pretty impractical, but there'd be nothing up there, and you come by and you hit a little horn, and your buoy pops up to the surface, and you get it, and you reset it, and you drop it down.
Oh, no way!
That is on the table right now.
Okay.
But I do.
And a time machine would be good too.
Right. No, and I hear people say that these populations are getting so small, genetic diversity is so low. They're really worried that at this rate, they are. Well, currently, when you have more deaths than births, you're on the road to extinction.
Big species with low fecundity.
Right. And so we have these serious challenges, and it is a combination of climate change, too many people on the planet, and so how do we make our way through this web that we've weaved?
Are you optimistic or pessimistic? Does it change day to day or hour to hour? About when you look at the world's oceans, I guess, because we've been really zoomed in on Maine, but I know you got a lot of experience in the Caribbean as well.
Yep.
And what's going on with coral there? And by the way, I guess that'd be another question I'd add to that is there's been a lot of scary headlines about coral in the last couple of years. Netflix did their documentary on it, I'm sure you're familiar with, and that was quite unsettling. And is it all that bad? And are you optimistic or pessimistic in general about the fate of not just the oceans, but the world's ecology and the survival of, I guess, ourselves and many other species?
Well, it's hard to be super optimistic given trends, but coral reefs, and I don't work just in the Caribbean. I work throughout the Indo-Pacific. I've done a lot of work in the Great Barrier Reef, Palau, most recently French Polynesia. And what I've been doing in French Polynesia and in Palau, I've been looking at recovery. And my work in the Caribbean is really how reefs recover from disturbances and how baby corals get started on reefs. French Polynesia suffered a massive bleaching event, not as bad as the northern Great Barrier Reef, but it was still bad. We got 40 to 60% mortality. I was working with a French group out there in 2016. I went back 2018, and I was recording lots of baby corals. So the resilience of some of these reefs is really striking, and the rule of thumb for the Indo-Pacific coral reefs is that they can recover completely in about a decade. But the question is whether the El Nino events are starting to increase in frequency such that we don't have a decade. 1983 was a bad year, a lot of mortality. The next big one was 1998. There was another one, smaller, 2010. And then 2015, 2016. The concern is that if the frequency is getting more rapid, that the time to recovery is going to be a lot less. And reefs are going to suffer. I think the ecosystem will be around. It's going to be profoundly different. It already is profoundly different. We don't have those giant sloths. Maned lions. And we'd love, most of the scientists who are working in climate and on ecosystems think that the global community has to do more, and the United States needs to be a leader. And the United States in recent years has not been a leader, and as a matter of fact, is being looked at very negatively by the global community. I've got scientist friends at the Resilience Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. The fellow who founded it. I won't name his name, but he will not travel to the United States under any circumstances.
Boycott?
Absolutely. All expenses paid, honor him, doesn't matter. It's a little bit like apartheid when South Africa afforded no rights to any of the black people who lived there. The global community said, no, we're just not going to work with you. And unfortunately, I'm seeing more people beginning to look at the United States that way, and that bothers me a lot. So there's a lot that we could do. I think power generation and distributed microgrids, solar, renewables, we should be doing a lot more with that. I travel all over the world. I was in Amsterdam last year, looking out to the North Sea, a whole line of huge wind generators. We're trying to do the same thing in Maine, and we can't get a single one established. We have big challenges, and one of the things I was just talking to a colleague about was in my decades of work, especially throughout the Indo-Pacific, I'm a big history buff. And so I've worked in Palau, and I've worked in Micronesia, and I'm just so impressed with what the United States was able to do in 4 years during World War II, mobilizing all of its forces after Pearl Harbor. Some places, some of the villages I worked in Papua New Guinea, they have no metal except for the bits that they have scavenged from the war effort. And we had landing strips in Papua New Guinea, and in Palmyra Atoll, where nobody had ever lived, they had they developed a hospital island there away from the Pacific Theater. I worked up in the Aleutians and find areas where the Japanese were turned back and boats were scuttled, and I'm just thinking, my gosh, this all happened in 4 years.
Yeah,
we developed a fleet. We developed technology. We fought a serious threat on two hemispheres, and we did it in 4 years. And the environmental challenge that we have today is easily of that level. But
more beyond that level.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
It's right. I mean, when you really think that our way of life is being threatened by Hitler or by Hirohito, people react. But when our way of life is being threatened by the environment, somehow, unfortunately, there are people, almost uniquely in the United States, who are still in deep denial about the problem. And, anybody who's tried to deal with serious problems knows the very first thing you have to do is get past denial. Mm-hmm. And the scientific community is frustrated. There are thoughtful people who point out that the scientific community has not necessarily found the best way to communicate. There's people like Randy Olson, who works in Los Angeles on his most recent book is Houston, We Have a Narrative, and he teaches people how to tell stories that get the message across. The CDC hires him to teach them how to get messages on Ebola and other human health issues out there. He has a book called Stop Being Such a Scientist. Scientists are often like a person who goes to, let's say, Japan for the first time and has never been someplace where people don't speak his language. And so the only thing he can do is talk loudly. It doesn't work. And scientists will just put, tons of data on the table and say, are there any questions? And, it's that is not exactly how it works.
I mean, Kim Kardashian gets more across by having her butt photoshopped and hanging over a sailboat gunnel, and it gets more attention. You know what I mean? It's because the story is more compelling to people in the way it's put forward. That's crazy.
Right. And so how do we, what you're doing is great, and it's why I'm happy to do this. There's not going to be any single panacea. My guess is, forgive me, but you probably have loyal listeners, and this is largely probably, like preaching to the choir. The question is, how do we get a meaningful dialogue to the people who, are still smart? I've had smart people, really smart people I went to high school with, and they were national merit scholars within the last year asking me if climate change is real. And I just have to figure out what is the most compelling way to describe, the consequences of having built up surplus carbon for 300 million years in various forms, coal and oil, and burning it in 2 centuries, and having a greenhouse effect that is not rocket science, but causing a lot of change, which starts creating more change. The climate scientists understand this. Most of the ecosystem scientists understand this. But we haven't been able to strengthen the ties between science and policy. And I would say that the United States in the 1960s was on a very good path that way. And my sense is it had to do with the history of science and politics, where we could have a Manhattan Project that was building off of thought experiments that Einstein did about the power that must exist within the atom, that we were able to split the atom, and we were able to bring, the atomic age, and, we could talk about the pros and cons of using the atom, but everybody got it. Okay, the science was able to do something that's amazing. You could argue that Kennedy saying we're going to put a person on the moon and then putting a person on the moon meant that science really seems to work. And some aspects of science is unquestionable, right? I mean, the questions are things about climate change. Somehow that science hasn't rung true for people.
Oh, because it impacts people's wallets, and it impacts people's lifestyle in a way, right? So it's people are resistant to that change that they...
It does. But other areas like engineering, you don't see cars coming to a screeching halt because they don't believe that bridge can hold them, right? That they believe that those engineers know what they're doing.
Right.
But the climate scientists, no.
Yeah.
But the trouble is that, I think we've unfortunately come into a time when just the strength of an idea, as opposed to, moneyed, lobbied interest groups, hired guns on one side or another side, make it impossible to sort out what's true.
It is getting complex, and I mean it's complex because I think another component of it being that we are coming through the end of the last glacial period.
Yep.
And into and so I think it gets complex because the deniers of climate change will point to other factors that are also present with. Regardless of anthropogenic climate change, there's also climate change, there's also background extinction, and I think people are confused about, well, what impact are people having?
They can be confused, and those cycles do exist, but those cycles are largely very well understood. And there's, Milankovitch cycles, which drive glaciation. Well, there's a famous memo from the National Academy of Sciences to Richard Nixon, basically saying that based on Milankovitch cycles, that we are due to be heading into another ice age. So in other words, the trend that is supposed to be happening right now is cooling, but that isn't exactly what's happening,
wasn't
right?
Feeling that this week.
Right. No, as a matter of fact, yesterday I saw on the news that in Maine, this has now been officially the warmest summer on record.
Ever.
Wow. Yep. June, July, and August. Warmest temperature ever.
I mean, we've had so many nights where it would be like daytime summer temperatures at night. It's been excruciating hot and humid.
Yep. And so, and we have fires not only on the west coast of in places like California and British Columbia, but also Europe is having fires. Australia has been for a long time. Last decade have been having a lot of fires. So, rainfall patterns are fundamentally changing, not the frequency, but the intensity of hurricanes, and so the water that they carry. So Hurricane Harvey dumping, 4 feet of rain in the Houston area. 2 hurricanes that hit Puerto Rico. These unfortunately are all part of climate change.
Yep, I had 3 friends have to evacuate from 3 completely different parts of the country and world last summer. I recall, just so much was happening. So I'd wrap it up with this, like in your heart of hearts, like do you think that human beings through this existential crisis we're coming to figure out a way through this, or do we just hobble along and lose species after species and environment after environment until there's so little left that, we're forced to some kind of dire, I don't know what, living underground or pushed into, you know what I mean? Are we going to push ourselves to a horrible, unthinkable extreme? Or do you think that we, do we continue on with this Anthropocene era, or do we come into this Ecozoic era? Like, how do you see this playing out?
Look, one of the things that I've said, you could count it up, the number of times I've said these ecosystems throw surprises at us all the time. So nobody can say where we're going to go from here. But I do think that the ecosystem is going to be fundamentally different than it is today. And I think these changes have very big human consequences. And so on the one hand, it's hard to be optimistic. But on the other hand, if you were a doctor working in an oncology lab, oncology ward, let's say in a hospital, you'd have to admit that most of these patients are going to die. But does that mean we don't do anything? And I'd say, no, it's still a good idea to do something, and we are making progress with cancer. We should be able to make progress with environmental aspects. I mean, if we could ever crack the nut of fusion energy and other new technologies that improve sustainability, maybe we could turn this thing around. And so I haven't given up hope, but it's hard looking at the trends, to be super optimistic that, in the next couple of decades, we're going to have Eden again.
It's like if we go from lobsters to fusion energy. That's so heady. Wow, Bob, it's been really awesome talking to you. I really appreciate the work you do, and thanks for taking the time with us today.
Sure. Good luck to you.
Grant, anything on your mind?
That's it. Thank you so much.
I know. I kind of want to eat a lobster, but I feel like it's profane almost.
No. I mean, look. One of the things that worries me is lobsters are hyper abundant, and
we're gonna knock them down a little bit.
We should, otherwise the disease breaks out.
Doing my part.
I like that.
Oh, it's fantastic. Thanks, Bob.
You bet.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. You can help us grow the show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh, new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out the WildFed video show and store. WildFed. Food is all around you.